You're listening to a Lutheran Conversation with your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. So hello and welcome to my newest podcast, Lutheran Conversation. I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland Australia, member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. The show, Lutheran Conversation, is the newest show produced by the Order of Knight George, which is a confessional Lutheran media ministry based in Australia, organised by myself. If you want to check out any of our content, you can find the Order of Knight George on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, or go to our website, www.knightgeorge.info. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on with this new show, A Lutheran Conversation. What is that? What is this about? What is this episode? Well, today's episode is going to be a pilot episode where I'm going to talk you through what this show is and explain the steps as we go. So a Lutheran Conversation is aimed at having a Lutheran conversation between Lutherans, particularly myself and some other Lutheran pastor. They can be from any synod, any country, and any kind of walk of Lutheranism. So I'm going to get confessional Lutherans, conservative Lutherans, liberal Lutherans, Pentecostal Lutherans, whoever is willing to come on and discuss Lutheranism with me. And so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to basically have 4 questions for the show that are going to work as conversation starters. So they're just going to kick off the conversation and we'll see where the conversation goes from there. First one's really easy. What church do you minister to? Or, if you're a retired pastor, what synod or whatever you belong to. Second question, just a brief history of how you got to where you are. I say brief because some people have really long stories and we could spend the whole hour or so talking about that. We want to keep it short. Third question, what's a contentious issue that you believe, or a contentious doctrine or something you believe? So this could be something that's controversial within your own synod, that most people in your synod don't hold to this view, or it could be something that's intersynodically controversial, your synod holds to it, but other synods don't, and that's why your synods are divided. Basically, it's something that you hold to. It could be even just a personal doctrine that you hold to that most other Lutherans don't hold to. Just something that's a bit controversial, contentious, that's going to, make people scratch their heads, maybe rile a few people up, something along those lines. And then the fourth question is just, what do you think is the most crucial issue regarding Lutheranism today? So what do you think is the biggest issue we need to sort out right now? What's something that you really wish Martin Luther could come to the 21st century and say, hey, this is how you should sort this matter out? Basically, what is something that you think is super important? So that's the 4 topics. And so for today's episode, for the pilot, we're going to walk you through this episode, and we're going to be doing this by interviewing myself. But I'm not going to interview myself. I've actually got a guest on to play host for the episode and interview me. This is a lay member of my church. He is part of my Lutheran mission over in the Philippines. It's Gerard. Gerard, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
So, hello everyone, my name is Gerard Salaksakan, and I'm a lay member of the St. John Lutheran Church located in Australia, in Queensland, Dalby. So, I'm also a first-year seminarian of the COEL, of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion, and I am doing my missions here in the Philippines at the moment.
So Gerard's going to help out by basically discussing these points with me so that it's not me for the whole episode just talking about myself, because that would be kind of boring. So the way these episodes are going to work is that we're going to aim for somewhere between half an hour to an hour. I would like to keep the episodes shorter if possible and more towards the half-hour mark, just so they're not such long episodes. But then again, I don't want to stifle any conversation. So if we're having a really good conversation about something, I don't want to just say, oh, it's half an hour, that's it, episode's over. I would like to say, let's keep going with this conversation, but note that the clock has now reached half an hour and we should probably start winding down the conversation. So, yeah, this episode we're basically going to walk through. So, Question 1 is, what church do I belong to? Well, we've kind of discussed it already in the introduction with myself and Gerard. I'm a pastor of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran congregation located in Dalby, Queensland, in the country of Australia, and it's a member congregation of the COELC, or Confessional, Orthodox, Evangelical Lutheran Communion. What is the COELC? It's a very new synod. We've only been around for, by the time this episode's being aired, a year and a half, 2 years, around about that time period. We're very small. We've got a sister congregation over in Denmark, and we've got a couple missions around the place. Gerard and me are recording this episode in the end of 2020. I don't know exactly when I'm planning to air this episode at the moment, so I don't know exactly how many churches are going to be part of the co-op by then. Maybe we've got some more missions. Maybe we've made fellowship. We do have some kind of churches we're talking with and we're hoping to progress towards fellowship with. So maybe by the time this episode's air, the co-op could be a bit bigger. Maybe it won't be. God willing, it will be. Basically, we're an international fellowship of Lutheran churches. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Unless Gerard's got any further questions, we can move on to point 2. So we'll move on to point 2, which is a history of how I got to where I am. And here I'm hoping Gerard might jump in a bit and ask me to delve deeper on certain questions. But basically, I was born and raised in the Lutheran Church of Australia. I was born, I was baptised, confirmed, raised in that church from day dot, pretty much. Then I decided to go to the seminary, which is called the Australian Lutheran College down in Adelaide, South Australia. Before I went, this point here is very important for my development, but before I went down there, the Bishop of Queensland, or I think they were still called presidents by that stage, not important, asked me to go do some kind of experience stuff before I go down to seminary. So he got me to be a youth leader on a bunch of youth camps that year preceding my studies at seminary, got me to get involved with a few things, get involved in Sunday school at the local churches, that kind of stuff. Now, when I went to these camps, I was really shocked because the congregation I had been raised in was a rather confessional, conservative Lutheran congregation in the Lutheran Church of Australia. Just to note, the congregation I was born and baptised and raised in currently is not so confessional. It's really gone downhill in the last half a decade. But it was pretty confessional, conservative growing up. And when I went to these youth camps, I was rather shocked when I met all these other Lutherans at these camps, and was shocked to hear some of the things coming out of the mouth of these people. They don't believe the Bible's inerrant. They don't believe in creationism. They think women can be pastors. They support gay marriage. Stuff like this. And I just thought, okay, they're young, they're uni students, they have no idea what they're talking about. Maybe they just need to go back to their pastors and get straightened out. Biggest shock for me then was when I got down to the seminary, started doing my SEM studies, and I heard the same nonsense coming out of the mouth of the lecturers. Not all the lecturers. There were some pretty good confessional Lutheran lecturers at the seminary. There's, I don't need to name names, but they know who they were, and I really appreciate the education I got from them. But there are a bunch of other lecturers down at the seminary which were just liberal Lutherans. They, Bible's not inerrant, creation doesn't exist, women can be pastors, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality, gay marriage is okay, and this is coming out of the people training the pastors. Not even, other SEM students were talking about this stuff, but the lecturers themselves. And this just, it really made me uneasy. It really made me question the confessionalism and just the orthodoxy of the Lutheran Church of Australia. And I had conversations with the lecturers. I met with the principal and the head of the pastoral school, and we talked about stuff, and I continued my studies for a bit. And what really happened in the end was basically a controversial issue that popped up where the church I was ministering in decided to start letting women give out Holy Communion. So the male pastor would consecrate it, but lay women could assist in the distribution. And so this was something that I knew existed in Lutheran churches, but I'd never belonged to a congregation that had it. And I was serving in a congregation at this point as the SEM student. I was placed there. I was given a permission to lead services. I was allowed to preach sermons. Wasn't allowed to consecrate. Wasn't allowed to do absolution. There's other issues that I would disagree with that way of doing things now. But that's the practice of like the Lutheran Church of Australia. Lay people can do these things. Essentially, I was kind of like a vicar, but not quite. It's the pastoral student. But what happened was the women started giving out communion, and I just was not comfortable taking communion from a woman. And I spoke to Pastor, and I asked him if I could take communion from him, from him. I said, if you've got you and a male lay person up there, I'll take it from both yous. But if you've got a female lay person up there, can I please request to have the communion just from you, the pastor, and not from a female lay person? Now that worked well for most services, but on the few services where I was assisting in leading and I assisted in giving communion, it was very strange that I wouldn't take communion from the woman assistant there. And this really kind of became a big matter. And it should be. I mean, I probably should have just kind of left the LCA earlier, but you standard, you want to keep the peace, you want to try and not create as much controversy as possible, all of that stuff. But what happened was all of this, it came back to the seminary. I was assigned vicarage. We'd already had our meetings. I'd done my 4 years of SEM studies, so then like your fifth year you go off on vicarage, you do your prac work. We'd all done our interviews, our meetings. I'd been assigned my vicarage location. I was heading down there later that year, but basically all this issue came up with lay women giving out Holy Communion, which happened only like a month or so before my vicarage would start. It was relatively all fresh, and the head of the pastoral school pulled me aside and said, well, basically, the teachings of the Lutheran Church of Australia says that women can give out Holy Communion. Like, lay women can distribute Holy Communion. If you're going to be a pastor, if you're going to be a vicar, you need to accept this. You need to take communion from a woman. And I said, I just can't. I don't agree with that. I said, the Lutheran Church doesn't allow women's ordination. And I think the prohibition against women pastors applied to all women, not just the office of the ministry. So lay women can't do these things. And, great, really got to sing the praises of the Lutheran Seminary of the LCA, particularly the head of the pastoral school. Again, I'm not going to name names, but he knows who he is if he's listening to this. People who have been to seminary, they know who the head of the pastoral school is. I've got to give him as much praise as I can. The way he dealt with the whole situation was very Christian, very polite, very organized. I met with him on 3 separate occasions. He said, okay, well, he heard me out. He let me argue my point of view. He argued back the LCA's position. He gave me papers to read. He told me, go read the LCA statement on this and that. Go read this. And we had several conversations back and forth about this. Now, what came to an end, this all came to an end when we'd had our 3 meetings. He told me to go away and make my final decision. I had to go to Queensland for a wedding at that stage, so we had to do the final meeting over a phone rather than in person. But he rang me up. He says, Jake, will you accept communion from a woman? I said, no. I started to explain why, and he said, Jake, we've already discussed this. I don't need you to explain it. I just need a yes or a no. Will you take communion from a woman? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'm sad to inform you then, you can't do your vicarage. And that was that. So they cancelled my vicarage, and that was it. They didn't kick me out of the synod, though. I was still a member of the Lutheran Church of Australia. They didn't kick me out of the seminary either. They did remove me from the pastoral school, so I would be doing it as a lay theologian rather than as a pastoral student. And I did meet with the seminary to discuss how I could finish my degree, because the seminary studies are actually university degrees. So I'd done my Bachelor in Theology, I was working on my Bachelor of Ministry. We were talking about how to do this. It was rather difficult because the Bachelor of Ministry does require a practical side. This is why they send you on vicarage. And we discussed things, and in the end I said, well, if I just withdraw from the seminary now, what do I get for the time and effort I've put in? And they told me that I would at least get an advanced diploma in ministry. And I said, well, it's just a piece of paper in the end. It doesn't really mean a whole lot, but I would like something to, acknowledge the work I've put in. I've got my Bachelor of Theology. I'll take my advanced diploma in ministry. I won't bother to finish my Bachelor of Ministry, and I'm leaving the seminary. And I'd also, at this stage, I'd reached out to a small micro-synod located in Queensland here called the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. I said to them, would they let me join them? Could I do my vicarage with them? Would they ordain me as a pastor? All that stuff. And they had approved that. They said yes, they would accept me. I would become an official member of the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, or AELC, and I'd start my vicarage under them. I move up to Queensland, I start my vicarage with the AELC. I'll continue my story unless Gerard wants to jump in with some more questions or comments about the history with the LCA.
Well, given the fact that you have experienced those kinds of difficulties in the Lutheran Church of Australia, doesn't that want you, to find another church that doesn't have the same problem, other than the Lutheran Church?
Yeah, okay, so if I understand your question, you're basically saying, if I've had all these problems with the Lutheran Church, why stay Lutheran? Well, because I believe Lutherans are the correct church. I believe that we are the true Christian church. To quote an Australian Lutheran pastor, Pastor Habart, in his book, he says, to be Christian is to be Lutheran, to be Lutheran is to be Christian. I believe what he's saying. The Lutheran Church is the Christian church. So I'm not going to give up on Lutheranism. The problem with the LCA is that I don't think they're a Lutheran church. Or I don't think they're a confessional Lutheran church. They've definitely got some errors within their church, and I can't be part of a church like that that's going to promote false doctrines and false practices in the church. And so I left them and I joined the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, which I thought was a much better church. For those who don't know the AELC, they're essentially imagine an old Missouri style church. Basically, they want to go back to the Missouri Synod of the 1930s, before a lot of the modernization in the Missouri Synod. And so I joined them and I started my vicarage with them. Now, what happened with them, and we can talk about this more later in the next question, because I do think this will pop up in the third question, but I looked at the issue of lay distribution, whether lay people can give out Holy Communion. Like I mentioned, the big issue with me in the Lutheran Church of Australia was lay women giving out communion. And so I had the question about, could lay men distribute communion? The AELC had 10 years prior to my joining them, had gone through a big debate over whether lay people could consecrate the elements. This ended to a big split, with a bunch of people who supported lay consecration leaving the church. The AELC said lay people can't consecrate the elements, but they can distribute elements that have been consecrated by a pastor. And I looked at their argument, I looked at what the Book of Concord said, and I just came to the conclusion where I said, I don't think that's right. I think it should be pastors only. I don't think lay people should be even distributing Holy Communion. Now, at this point in time, I wasn't trying to make a definitive statement. I wasn't trying to say, I'm correct, I'm right, that's the only way it's going to be, the AELC is heretical, I'm leaving. No, I wanted to make a discussion about this. And so I wrote a paper, which is now available as a book. I've actually released and updated. I did a second version of this, which I've updated. I've released it as a book. It's on the Order of Knight George website. You can buy the book, all that. But I wrote a paper called Should We Have Lay Distributors? And the book just looks at the Bible, the Book of Concord, church history. Should lay people be able to give out Holy Communion? Now, obviously, I took the conclusion of no, they shouldn't be. But at this point in time, I wasn't making a definitive statement. I wrote the paper to raise discussions with the pastors, and then hopefully after having discussed it with the pastors, we could take the discussions to the laity and have them, and we could vote on the matter or whatever the AELC wants to do. If it turns out that I was convinced that lay people shouldn't give out Holy Communion, but the AELC was going to continue to let lay people give out Holy Communion, then I would have said, I have to break fellowship, I'm going to walk out. So, I was prepared that might be an option. But the current stage, I was like, let's just discuss the issue. Let's study the issue. I don't want to break fellowship. All of this stuff, let's study the issue. And I wrote the paper, and I gave it to the pastors of the AELC. And they read it. I get a message from one of the pastors one day asking if he could show it to some of the elders of the church, and I said, yeah, go for it. That's fine. I'd like that. That's okay. And it became a big mess. But long story short, the elders didn't like it. What's known as the coordinating committee of the AELC. So this is all the pastors of the AELC plus representatives from each of the congregations. They form the organisation, like the leadership of the AELC. They take care of all the bureaucracy and the politics and stuff like that. They had a meeting one Sunday afternoon. It was a secret meeting, and they voted to cancel my vicarage and to excommunicate me from the synod, pretty much. I say pretty much because the actual excommunication process was very complicated. I can get to that in a second. But they just agreed to cancel my vicarage, reject my paper, and all of that. They decided this one Sunday night. I get an email Monday morning telling me that I was no longer a vicar of the AELC and that I wasn't allowed to say anywhere publicly that I was a member of the AELC. Now, this is why I say the excommunication process was complicated, because the way the email was worded is it sounded like I was kicked out of the synod. They said I couldn't tell people I was a member of the AELC, which to me sounds like you're no longer a member of the AELC. But I contacted Pastor Peter, the pastor of the AELC, and I said, am I excommunicated? Like, I wanted him to just definitively confirm it for me. Say, just confirm this for me. Am I excommunicated? And his response was, well, the coordinating committee doesn't have the power to excommunicate you. That belongs to the individual congregations. And he says, it's up to the congregation to excommunicate me. And to this day, the congregation that I was a member of, the St. John's congregation of the AELC, has never officially told me I was excommunicated. They've never officially told me that. They never actually said to me that I wasn't a member there. This is why I myself, when I reached out to a group called the OLCC, and I reached out to them for fellowship, I took it upon myself to write a letter to the AELC saying I'm withdrawing membership because it has never been told officially that I'm excommunicated. I will make the effort to officially withdraw membership. I don't even know if they read that letter. I emailed it to the pastor of that congregation. I never got a reply from him. I never heard anything from the congregation. I don't even know if he read it. He may have seen the email come from me and deleted it for all I know. But I did send them an email saying that I am officially withdrawing membership. And then I approached a group called the OLCC. They had a falling out over universal objective justification, and that led to a split within their church. And I sided with the members who were getting basically kicked out / withdrawing membership. And from there I joined with Pastor Magnus Sorensen of the congregation over in Denmark, and we formed the co-alc. And that's then basically a brief history. If you've got any further comments about my history, I can fill you in on some details here and there if you've got more questions. No? After I was excommunicated from the AELC, I contacted the pastors and I said, well, hold on, this is an overreaction. All I wanted to do was discuss my paper. I wrote the paper in order to have a discussion. I wanted to discuss it with you pastors, then take it to the laity after we'd discussed it. this is not, I hadn't made a definitive statement. I never anywhere said that I will not take communion from a lay person. This is my official position. That hadn't happened. They just read my paper and said, well, Jake has concluded in his paper that we shouldn't have lay distributors. That doesn't agree with what the AELC teaches. Jake's kicked out. They never even gave me a reason. Like, the AELC has this document called The Word Shall Stand, and when I asked them for why my position was wrong, they said it contradicted the Word Shall Stand, and they directed me to that statement. And I said, well, I know of that statement. I'm well aware of that statement. But the statement simply says, a lay person can't consecrate, but they can distribute. I said, there is no Bible reference, there's no Book of Concord reference, there's not even an explanation. It just is a blank statement that you guys have made. You need to give me an explanation for why that is biblical and Lutheran. And they wouldn't discuss it with me. I had one pastor who told me, he said, there's nothing to discuss. The only thing left for you to do, Jake, is to recant and repent. To which I had to have my here I stand moment where I said, I won't recant my paper until you can tell me why it is wrong. Because if I recant it now and it turns out to be correct, I am then recanting truth, and that is wrong. I will recant it the moment you show me it is wrong. But until you do that, I'm not recanting it. And they couldn't do it. I did later receive from one of the pastors, he wrote a response to me he wrote a response to my paper, and I responded to that paper as well, which was this was the kind of dialogue I was wanting, but he never responded to my response. So basically, the whole conversation with the AELC was, I wrote my paper. Some of the pastors didn't even want to discuss it. One pastor was decent enough to send me a response. I sent him a reply. He never responded to me a second time, and that was the end of the conversation. Basically, it was like, well, I sent you my first response, and that's good enough. If you don't accept that, then get lost. So, yeah, basically, like I said, I'm not trying to just badmouth the AELC, but the way they handled the division, the way they handled it compared to how the LCA handled it is just poorly done. And with that, we'll move on to the third part of this question, which is, what is a contentious matter? And I think I have already actually answered this question. And what is a contentious belief that I hold to? That is, I don't think lay people can distribute Holy Communion. That's the contentious matter I hold to. The reason why is that I believe the Bible makes it quite clear that God has instituted the office of the ministry for the giving out of word and sacrament. And lay people, that is non-ordained people, should not participate in this. I believe the Book of Concord is clear on this point. Article 14 of the Book of Concord says that nobody should preach, teach, or administer the sacraments unless they have been rightly called. And that means they've been called by a church and they've been publicly ordained. If they haven't done that, they can't publicly preach and teach, and they can't administer the sacraments. Now, I'm not out ruling emergency baptism. The church has supported that all the way, going back to at least St. Augustine. The Book of Concord quotes St. Augustine, where St. Augustine says you can baptize, a lay person can baptize in an emergency situation. But I don't think there's any emergency situation that would permit a lay person to either consecrate or distribute the elements. There is a stronger case for lay consecration than there is for lay distribution. Because at least with the case of lay consecration, you're saying no pastor is around, it's an emergency situation. I disagree there, but they'd say it's an emergency situation, there's no pastor available, we need a lay person to consecrate. Well, when it comes to lay distribution, you don't need a lay person to distribute because the pastor can do it. There's no absolute necessity of a lay person distributing. We only do it out of ease and convenience. It's easier to have lay people assist the pastor. It's easier to have 2 or 3 people give out Holy Communion. It's not essential. It's not necessary. It's necessary that a pastor is there, but it's not necessary that the lay people have to be there. And I know this is a controversial topic, but there are actually plenty of Lutherans that agree with me. And there's a particular Pastor Stephen Vanderhoek, who was the first person that got me onto this issue, and in his book that he wrote on Holy Communion. He leaves us in a footnote on lay distribution, but he made many of the arguments that I picked up for my paper actually came from his book first. I kind of added a few things to Pastor Vanderhoek's argument, but majority of my paper was based on Pastor Vanderhoek's teachings. So, that's one pastor that I know of who supports me. There's other churches like the Eldona, they don't allow lay distribution. The OLCC, the church I reached out to before I founded the co-op with Pastor Magnus, they don't have lay distribution. There's quite a lot of churches that don't support lay distribution, and they see it as non-confessional. They see it as non-biblical and not confessionally Lutheran. There are a bunch of other churches like the Wells and the Missouri synods that do have lay distribution, and there are quite a lot of people then that find this as a controversial, contentious point when I say that lay people can't distribute Holy Communion. That's the controversial doctrine that I hold to. Gerard, you're here. Any thoughts or comments or questions you want to have on the topic of lay distribution while you're here?
Yeah. So really, the lay distribution has been really a great and controversial topic among even the Roman Catholic Church. So I guess it's really a proper thing to correct these kinds of stuff, even though we know that this practice goes against the Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession, and nowhere does it states also in the just a comment on and to support it on the scripture, and even in the Book of Concord does it say that even a lay person could administer the sacrament of the Lord's Supper on the other people.
So I'll bring up one point of a place that supports lay distribution, and I'm using air quotes here. I know there's an audio podcast and people can't see air quotes, but I'm using air quotes around the word supports, because when I had this discussion with the AELC, I mentioned that one of the pastors of the AELC did send me a response paper, and one of his arguments in favour of lay distribution was the canons of the Nicene Council. And he quotes, I forget the exact numbers, I don't have them in front of me, but he's like, canon number 17 or whatever it was of the Nicene Council said that a deacon can distribute the cup. It says the priest consecrates and a deacon can distribute. And they said, there you go, proof that from the early church, lay people could distribute Holy Communion. There you go. And I, in my response to them, I went and looked up the canons of the Council of Nicaea, and I said, you've made a mistake in assuming that these deacons are lay people. If you go to Canon 3 of the Nicene canons, Canon 3 of the Nicene Council, you'll see that bishops, priests, and deacons are clearly defined as ordained members of the office of the ministry. So, no, Canon 17 or whatever of the Nicene Council does not support lay distribution, because earlier in that same council, they defined a deacon as basically an assistant pastor. He was an assistant, but he was ordained. And so therefore, the idea that a deacon could assist in the distribution is not a lay person assisting in distribution, but an assistant pastor assisting in distribution. So the priest or the overseeing pastor consecrates, but then the deacon or assistant pastor assists in the distribution. So that's the closest evidence you could find of lay distribution is like that. And well, no, because I know that there is some confusion around the term deacon, and I do in my paper now book, Should We Have Lay Distributors? I do go through the history of the term deacon, and I do point out that different churches and different regions and different times periods have used the word deacon in different ways. Sometimes it's used as a pastor, sometimes it's used for a lay person. Martin Luther himself actually uses the term interchangeably, and Chemnitz doesn't talk about the term deacon, but Chemnitz does point out that the word elder or presbyter is a term that throughout church history has been used sometimes for lay elders and sometimes for ordained pastor elders. And so Chemnitz pointed that out with the term elder. He didn't talk about the term deacon, but it does happen with the word deacon. Like You can look at sometimes in scripture where Paul uses the term deacon, and it's clearly referring to a pastor. Considering the word deacon is just the Greek version of the Latin minister. So they are the same word. But there is also sometimes, for example, with Phoebe, who's a woman, and we know that women can't be pastors, she's called a deaconess. Therefore, since we know that women can't be pastors and she's a deaconess, that therefore she must be a lay deaconess. And so there's other situations like the 7 deacons in Acts. I know some traditions say they were ordained as assistant pastors. Martin Luther took the position that they were lay people until he points out, Luther says that Philip, the evangelist, he was later ordained and became Philip the evangelist, but he taught that when he was Philip the deacon, he was a lay deacon. I know the terms have been interchangeable through history, but my point here is that the canons of the Council of Nicaea when they use the term deacon, they are talking about pastors. They're not talking about laity. So you can't use canon, like I said, I forget which one it is, but it's like 15, 17, somewhere. It's lower down in the list that says a deacon can give out the wine. No, because the council, whenever it talks about deacons, is referring to assistant pastors. So, we're past the halfway point, we're past the half hour, so we'll try and wrap this up now with our 4th question. As I said, the 4th question is, what is an issue that you think is the most crucial issue in Lutheranism today? And for me, I believe the most crucial issue for Lutheranism today is church fellowship. Particularly, I want to focus on the issues of open communion and this idea of what's known as selective fellowship. For those people that don't know, selective fellowship is this midway position between open communion and closed communion. So closed communion says you can't commune with me unless we're in church fellowship. Open communion says, I'm going to commune with anyone and everyone, doesn't matter what you believe, pretty much. Selective fellowship is this position in the middle that says we're going to base church fellowship on individuals rather than churches. So the closed communion position would say things like, your church has to be in fellowship with our church. So, for example, Missouri Synod is in fellowship with the AALC. So people from the AALC can commune in the Missouri Synod Church. But Missouri Synod is not in fellowship with the Wisconsin Synod. So therefore, members of the Wisconsin Synod can't commune in a Missouri Synod Church, and vice versa. That's closed communion. Selective fellowship is this practice where basically the individual pastors and the individual laity get to make church fellowship based on personal beliefs, pretty much. If the Missouri Synod, they're officially the Missouri Synod, their official position is closed communion, although I think I know there are numerous pastors in the Missouri Synod that practice selective fellowship. I know that because the Lutheran Church of Australia is not in fellowship with the Missouri Synod, and yet many Missouri Synod members commune in Lutheran churches in Australia, and many members of the Lutheran Church of Australia, when they go to America, commune in Missouri Synod churches. But those two church bodies are not in fellowship. So this is not closed communion, this is not altar and pulpit fellowship, this is selective fellowship, where individuals, pastor is saying, hey, I know that your church body's not in fellowship with me, but I'll let you, the individual, commune here. Somewhere like the LCA, they call it responsible communion. They don't call it selective fellowship. They actually have this document written from like 1993, I think it is, that's called responsible communion. That's the LCA's official statement. And the LCA takes us a step further and will commune Roman Catholics and Anglicans and Baptists and stuff like that. Now, the LCA officially says that you can't commune at our altars unless you accept the Lutheran teaching on Holy Communion. But again, I know from personal experience that there are many Lutheran pastors in the LCA that just basically practice open communion and will just let anyone come to their altars. But officially, their official practice of the LCA is selective fellowship. And so they'll commune individuals from the Catholic Church if, quote, he accepts the LCA's position of Holy Communion. I don't know how thorough. There are certain pastors I do know that have gone to the effort of actually checking this, so they will actually they'll sit down and say, okay, I know you're a Baptist and you go to a Baptist church, but do you believe in the real presence? The person will say, yes, I do. And you say, okay, well, you can commune in the Lutheran Church. Now, the problem here is that person then 1 week communes in a Lutheran church, next week communes in a Baptist church. Well, one of those churches has real communion and one of them doesn't. And so this person is having real communion 1 week and false communion the next week. So this is a big problem. But that's not mainly the most issue that I'm most worried about with Lutheranism. What I am most worried about with Lutheranism is this failure to break fellowship these days. And this is something that has stemmed from the issues of selective fellowship. And that is that pastors no longer break fellowship often. And what I mean here is that there are many pastors in the Missouri Synod and the Lutheran Church of Australia who I know personally. We agree on 99.99% of doctrine. And I say that. The reason I don't say 100% is because there's one thing we don't agree upon. And that is, I say I can't commune with the heterodox, whereas they say they will continue to commune with the heterodox. They will agree with me that the LCA has wrong teachings. They will agree with me that the LCA has false practices. And yet, they will not leave the LCA. There are pastors in there that will say, hey, the LCA's official public statement is this, and I think that is false. And I say to them, well, then you should leave. Because as a member of that church, their public statement is your position. As long as you're a member of that church, you accept their public statements as your official teaching. You should leave. And they don't. And they won't leave. And they're like, oh, no, I'll just, personally hold this and I'll personally do this. And there are many pastors, like I said, there are many pastors that agree with me on most doctrines except this issue of church fellowship. Like, if they could accept a true closed communion position, and that they would stop communing in the LCA, I would welcome them with open arms into the co-el. And they would be most welcomed here. And we wouldn't argue, we wouldn't debate, we'd actually agree. But they don't want to leave the bigger church body. This is the problem. This is why I think church fellowship is the most crucial issue for Lutheranism today. Because selective fellowship doesn't create more unity. It actually creates more division. Because you could have a bunch of pastors in the LCA leave and come and join me and form a bigger co-elk, or they can stay in the LCA where they constantly fight with their fellow pastors. The LCA has 4 times now voted on the issue of women's ordination. They continue to debate this issue. They could split the church and be done with it, but they don't and they won't. And so instead, they just keep fighting over and over and over, and this creates more disunity, more hatred for their fellow brother, for their fellow Christian. More people leaving a church because they don't want to belong to a church where people are constantly fighting. They could leave the churches they belong to and come join me. Or it doesn't have to be me. I'm not even saying they have to join me. Like, there are pastors in the LCA that I think should leave, but wouldn't be welcome in the co-op because there's just things that we don't agree upon. But I know there are churches out there that they could go and join. There are pastors in the LCA that could easily get along with the AELC. There are pastors in the LCA that could help form a Missouri Synod sister church here in Australia. There are pastors there that may not agree with me, but they may agree with some other synod. And I think it's high time that they get out of the LCA and go join a synod that they actually agree with. This is the problem. People keep belonging to churches where they don't agree with each other. Now, that is going to happen with churches, and, that is an issue. But I do think a bigger issue is pastors that say, I don't agree with the public teachings of the church, and yet I'm going to belong to that church. I mean, seriously, this is one of the reasons why I told people I couldn't be a member of the LCA. I said, because in your ordination vows, this is why I wouldn't accept communion from a woman. Because when you get ordained in the LCA, there is an actual vow in the ordination rite that says, I vow to uphold the public teachings and practices of the Lutheran Church of Australia. I vow to submit to the oversight of the Bishop of the Lutheran Church of Australia. And I said, well, I can't do that in good conscience if I don't agree with the practices and teachings of the LCA. Your ordination vow says that you will uphold those positions. And if you don't uphold those positions, then you should leave and find a church where you agree with their position. Don't belong to a church where you can't uphold their teachings. Don't belong to a church where you can't uphold their practices. Leave that church and go and find a church that you can uphold those practices. This is why there is one other seminarian student who I went to seminary with, who me and him disagree theologically, but I respect him so much for his conviction to leave the LCA. He was in like his third year of seminary, and he realized that he no longer believed what the Lutheran Church taught, and he believed what the Baptists taught. And he left the Lutheran Church and he went and joined the Baptist Church. Now, I'm not a Baptist. I don't agree with the Baptist. I think he's teaching false doctrine and doing false practices in the Baptist Church. But I respect him so much because he actually had the conviction to say, I don't agree with the Lutherans. I'm not going to stick around in this church. I'm going to leave and I'm going to go join the Baptists. And I like I said, I've got to applaud that. I respect that. I think more Lutherans need to do that. More Lutherans need to say, I don't agree with what this church teaches, I'm going elsewhere. And that would fix problems. And I do truly think it would fix problems. I'm a history buff, and I've done a lot of research into the different Lutheran churches in Australia. At one point in Australian history, there was about 8 different synods in Australia. And guess what? If you disagreed with one of those churches, you could go and join one of the other churches. And this happened quite a lot. Congregations, pastors, laity often switched churches. Like they'd be born in this church, but then they'd go and join that church. And people switched all the time because they were going to the church that they actually believed was the true church. They weren't saying, well, I better stick around in this church. And that's why the union of the Lutheran Church of Australia has been the most damaging to church fellowship, because now it has put like a monopoly on Lutheranism. Like, there are about 13, 14 so different Lutheran church bodies in Australia. The LCA is the biggest. The second biggest is the AELC with 7 congregations and 2 pastors. The third is the ELCR, which has 5 congregations and 3 pastors. And beyond that, the other churches are pretty much like the COELC. I mean, we've got like a church over in Denmark, we've got some mission church plants we've got going, but in Australia, I'm the only congregation here in Australia. And so we are small, we are a micro-synod, and the problem is, people have a hard time leaving the big church for the small church. It takes someone with a lot of conviction to actually say, I'm going to leave the big church and go join the little church. I've had people when I was in the AELC say to me like, I'd love to join you guys, but you're too small. Or, I'd love to join you guys, but you don't have a congregation in this part of the country. And stuff like that. And I'd say, well, what if you guys join us, then we could be bigger. If you joined us, we could have a church in that part of the country. But they don't want to leave the big church. And so the Lutheran Church of Australia has got this monopoly on Lutheranism in Australia. And even though there's like another dozen Lutheran church bodies in Australia, most of those are like 1 or 2 congregations. And so they're tiny, they're small, they're isolated to certain areas. Out of those dozen, probably about 3/4 of them are located in southeast Queensland. They're not spread out. They're not all over the country. They're not everywhere. And so it actually is difficult to join these smaller churches. And this is why the union of the LCA has actually been more damaging, because it has now forced everyone to stay in this big body. It has forced people to stay as a part of this one big church, where they have to keep fighting and arguing. If we were back in the old days where there were 8 different synods, or even 2 or 3 different synods in Australia, but like all of equal sizes, then it would be easier for people to switch between synods, and there would be less division and fighting within synods. And so, I think church fellowship is the most crucial issue for Lutheranism today. I think churches need to readopt the historical practice of closed communion. We need to stop having selective fellowship. We need to not have fellowship with churches that we disagree with. We need to step up and say, if I can't confess the public teachings and practices of this church, I'm going to leave it. We need people to actually break fellowship with heterodox and then unite in fellowship with Orthodox people. And I'm just going to put this out there again to all those people in the Lutheran Church of Australia or the Missouri Synod or wherever you are in the world. If you agree with the teachings of the COALC, but you're worried about breaking church fellowship with the LCA or the Missouri Synod or whichever church body you belong to, I urge you, please go where you think the true teaching is. If you agree with the COALC and you don't agree with your church body you currently belong to, then leave it and come join me. Come join the COALC. And if you don't agree with the COALC, then go find another church. Like maybe you don't agree with the LCA, but you do agree with Missouri Synod. Maybe you don't agree with Missouri Synod, but you agree with the Wisconsin Synod. Maybe you agree with Aldona. I don't know what you believe, but I encourage and urge you to please leave heterodox church bodies and pursue Orthodox church bodies. Don't belong to a church if you disagree with their doctrine. Don't belong to a church if you disagree with their practices. Instead, find a church that you do agree with. Find a church that you're not constantly fighting with. And I think that goes all the way back to where we started with this conversation, as to me being born and raised in the LCA and finding that it was absolutely filled with liberalism and heterodoxy, and me leaving that church because of that. Like, I was so uncomfortable studying at the seminary because there was so many things being taught there that I just could not agree with, and it just made me so anxious and uneasy the whole time I was a part of that synod at that seminary studying to be a pastor. And I can't imagine what it would be like for people who are actually pastors in that synod who can't confess the teachings of their own synod. To me, that would just drive me insane, and I couldn't in good conscience continue to minister in a church that I just didn't agree with their official teachings and practices. And I'm saying if you have that same level of discomfort, it's probably because the church you belong to is heterodox and you need to leave and find a church that isn't. That discomfort is God telling you that these are wrong teachings, these are false teachings, these are false practices. It's time for you to get out. So listen to that urging from God. Leave. Go find a church that you do agree with. Go unite around word and sacrament with churches that you agree with. And that's really something that I want to achieve with this Lutheran conversation. I want to get pastors on from different synods. Pastors from the Missouri Synod, pastors from the Wisconsin Synod, pastors from the LCA, pastors from Aldona, pastors from even the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia. I want you pastors to come on this show and tell me about your church. Tell me what it teaches. Tell me why it's different. Tell me why your church is, in your opinion, the correct church and why people should join you. Come and tell me why they should leave the church they're currently in and join your church. Come and tell me what makes the Lutheran Church of Australia different to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. What makes the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod different? These are the things I want to talk about on this show. These are the things I want to pursue. I want to get pastors on from all the different synods to come on and talk about not only their synod, but also about their own personal beliefs. Maybe they're not in the right synod. Maybe they need to look elsewhere. We could discuss those on this show, because that's what this show is aimed at being. A conversation. A Lutheran conversation. A talk show where we can discuss theology and discuss the differences in the different Lutheran churches. Discuss what theology is being taught in Lutheran churches and why that church is different to that church. Why is modern Lutheranism different to Lutheranism in the 1900s or Lutheranism in the 1600s? These are all the things I want to discuss on this show. And so, if you're a pastor out there and you're listening to this podcast, I would like to encourage you to please contact me, either via Facebook, or you can get me via email. There's the Order of Knight George email, which is knightgeorge@outlook.com.au, or you can contact the COALC, which is our email address is the coalc-atc@hotmail.com. That's the email we use for our Ask the Consistory YouTube channel, so you can contact us there as well. If you're a pastor, I encourage you to contact me reach out to me and say, hey Jake, I heard your show, I would like to participate, I'd like to come on an episode and tell you about my synod and my history and my theological beliefs. Or if you're a layperson and you know a pastor that you would like to hear on this show, you contact me and I'll then get in contact with him or her, if you want a female pastor to come on. I don't agree with women's ordination, but I would be welcome to have women pastors come on. Let's have them come on. We'll talk about women's ordination, why they think it's okay for them to be a pastor. If you've got a pastor in mind that you'd like to see on this show, contact them and tell them to contact me. Or contact me and tell me, hey Jake, I would like to see Pastor da-da-da come on the show, and I'll do my best to get him on. I'll reach out to him, hopefully he'll say yes and we'll get him on the show. If he doesn't, I'm sorry. If he's not willing to come on, maybe it's time for you, the listener and the layperson, to contact that pastor and urge him to actually reach out and come onto my show. With all that said, Gerard hasn't really spoken a lot this episode. I brought him on to be a bit of a conversational guest with me. So Gerard, is there any more thoughts, comments or questions you'd like to bring up just before we wrap up this episode? And I'm just going to wrap up the show. And so thank you for listening to this very first episode. Thank you for listening to this pilot episode of A Lutheran Conversation. So thank you for listening to this pilot episode of A Lutheran Conversation. I hope you have enjoyed the format of this show. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about my church, a bit about my history, a bit about my beliefs and what I think's important in Lutheranism. I hope you've had a good time listening. I hope I can get more Lutheran pastors on future episodes and you can enjoy listening to them as well. With that, I'm going to get going. Goodbye, God bless, and hope you can listen to another Lutheran Conversation next time. Goodbye.